Oil and gas are so last century. The 21st century is due to be dominated by renewable green energy. Wind, solar, sea power, electric cars. Well, that's the conventional wisdom. However, with man's insatiable desire for power ever increasing, oil and gas are likely to be around for some time yet. But for how long? I'm here tonight with Henry Edmundson, a leading consultant in the field, to examine the future of global energy production and the future of the oil and gas industry during this time of transition. Henry, welcome.
Thank you.
Oil and gas, it will run out, but how far are you away from that crucial time?
Well, it's a good question. Not in any immediate future. Maybe 100 years from now, we're really going to have to start getting slightly panicked, but there is more there than you might expect by reading the newspapers. And the only problem is that the oil that's there is getting harder to get out. So it's almost as though the easy oil has been produced. And by easy meaning technologically it's been easy to get out, it's been cheap to get out. And now we're faced with moving into areas where, for various reasons, geological, logistical, it's far more difficult to get the oil out of the ground, costs more. But we're going to have to do it, and we're already beginning to do it. And the same, by the way, applies to gas. So gas is now a super hot item, and the same story goes for gas. But the reserves of both are huge. And in the lecture I'm going to give tonight, I'll show you the actual numbers of what we believe is there, what we produced, and what is left. And what is left is an order of magnitude greater than what we've already produced.
Right. There's increasing competition from other energy sources now, renewables especially. How can the oil and gas industry persuade people that it's still one of the best choices for energy production, as opposed to being a choice of last resort?
Well, obviously there's a lot of interest in renewable energy, wind energy. Well, there's always nuclear energy, hydroelectric energy, biofuel energy, and so on. But in the best predictions that are available, and again I'll show them in this lecture, even going out to 2030, oil, gas, fossil fuels, which is to say oil, gas and coal, constitute at least 80% of what's required to feed the world's energy needs. And there is really no way that that's going to change in the next 20 years. So it's all for the good to develop renewable energies, but their impact is much smaller than I think the public ever realizes. And particularly significant for the next 20 years until 2030 is the increase of coal consumption. So coal is a huge big business now. The reserves are in the States, they're in China, they're in Australia, and the transport of coal is as big a deal as the transport of oil in supertankers. So coal is a dead industry in this country for various reasons, but it's certainly not in the world, and it's going to actually feed the world's thirst for energy more than any other source for the next 20 years.
Oil and gas and coal are seen as major contributors to global warming. How can we mitigate against these effects?
Well, so there's two things there. There's the technical challenge of getting rid of the CO2, and this is a huge topic in general, and particularly for the oil industry, because in fact we know how to do it already, and that is because we've been doing it for years. We pump large amounts of CO2 into reservoirs, basically to push the oil out. So it's a very small step to actually create reservoirs where we simply want to push the CO2 in there just to get rid of it. So technically, there are a few problems, but technically it can be done, and it's done today in experiments, and my company is involved in many of them. The main problem is the political and economic problem. Who is going to pay? We know how much it costs to push the CO2 into the subsurface. Who is going to pay? So Europe has been playing with a cap and trade system, The US are thinking up something else, but that's the main problem, and that is what things like Copenhagen are all about. But from a technical point of view, it's more or less a solved issue. The only problem is you have to do it close to power stations. So the key contributor to CO2 are power stations and cars running on the road. Now, cars running on the road, you can't capture the CO2 because the car's moving. So you can convert the cars to electrical power. Near the power stations, you can definitely do something about it. And you can capture the CO2 and find a geological formation near the power station where you can pump the stuff in. And as I say, technically, these are not insuperable problems.
The nuclear option has crept back onto government policies across the globe. How big a feature will nuclear power be in the future?
Well, I think that again is a purely political issue. We know it's possible. The French are sort of the key nuclear producers. They had a policy from years ago to rely hugely on nuclear power. They've done it very safely. They have a better safety record, I think, than the British, the Americans, certainly the Russians. So they've proved that it's possible. But for each individual country to follow that path requires a political decision that everybody's afraid to take. And there's one slight additional issue, which is nuclear waste. So again, the French managed to lick that one too. In many countries, many developed countries, they've been investigating the nuclear waste problem. For instance, in the UK, there was a decade-long study to find a site where you can put nuclear waste, and they identified somewhere up near the Lake District. So it has to be deep, it has to be geologically quiescent, and they finally decided, after a huge amount of work, that it was too dangerous. Right, so that's the political decision. French, meanwhile, have a site somewhere in the middle of France. They're going ahead and they're doing it. They have to. You know, they, having developed all these nuclear power stations, they've got to do something with the waste. So, again, it's politics.
Can green renewable energy sources ever really provide for the massive requirements of power which mankind require in the future?
I don't really know the answer to that question. I only know that it scares me, actually, because I was told that you require 1,000 gallons of water to irrigate a piece of ground that will produce 1 gallon of oil. Right? So that seems a little bit... So you're using huge water resources. A study actually came out, I think in this country, in the last week, that, or maybe it was an international study, which concluded that the carbon capture that you lose by cutting down forest and planting palm oil groves to produce the oil actually takes away the ability to absorb carbon dioxide more than it does the usefulness of burning the oil. So I'm pretty skeptical.
Henry, thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure. Yep.